So this marks FiiO's first ever planar magnetic headphone, and I'm very curious what to expect. The box, super plain, not really a whole lot of exciting happening there. So far, this is very reminiscent of the FT3. An extra set of pads, which is nice. I'm curious if these are different. They're perforated on the inside, but not on the face or the outside. Okay, and then nice. Comes with the very Focal-esque carry case that also came with the FT3. I like this case a lot. For the price range, these always felt really premium for me. Like, this is a kind of case that you would like buy separately, I feel like, for a lot of other headphones. But you actually get like a custom molded interior, which is nice. And then it comes with a set of adapters, a very sleek looking XLR adapter, and it does look like this comes with an interchangeable tip system, which is very nice. It's a pretty elegant looking system, actually. This may not look like it, but this feels ridiculously well built. Like, this actually feels like super solid. Like, everything feels just really nice here. I'm not sure what the chassis is, but it feels great. It feels solid. It's like dense but not too heavy. Way better built than something like a Sundara. I just looked it up and it's an aluminum silver chassis. Spring steel seems fine, decent bit of clamp force, but not a lot. The headband extension looks nice. It's got a leather outside and the same material that's on the pads. I think it's a micro suede on the inside, and then a 3.5 millimeter slightly recessed input for the cables. But this overall design is very like size comparative to a Sundara. It's not very big, actually. It actually seems like a very slim planar design. Not a huge fan of these clicking things. I wish they would use magnetics, but that's what the driver is looking like. Definitely not bad. Not as exciting as the Para, but we'll see if it's more effective than the Para, which for the price tag, I hope it is. I think that actually looks really nice. Very good job so far, Fiio. We'll see how it sounds. Okay, so the FT5. It's actually a really interesting planar. It's got a couple properties that are pretty unique about it. With the stock pads that come on it, the overall characteristics are a warm, soundstagey, detailed planar magnetic headphone. There are a couple quick concerns that I have about this so far that I want to touch on, but the overall sound fidelity is a warmer, smoother sound, and I don't think that anybody is going to complain about that. I am personally really curious about the second set of pads they have because I'm curious if that will resolve some of those concerns, but I and you will have to wait for the full review. Today, we're just looking at the stock pads. Let's start with one concerning area for me, which is the treble response. The downside to a warmer sounding sound signature like this is a slight veil in some of the treble response regions, making some instruments seem really detailed and really clear, and they cut through really well. And then other instruments seemingly have some level of a veil or some obscurity to them that doesn't quite let them cut through to the same level. For example, a lot of string and brass instruments that hit higher notes like violins and trumpets don't seem to cut through as well as some metallic instruments like chimes and triangles. This slight veil to the upper end, I think, leads this to not be the widest sound-staging and most open sounding headphone that is out there right now. I think something like a Sundara will seem a little bit more open. It's got a little bit more of a transient treble response that is a little bit more obvious and clear. However, this doesn't necessarily have to be a downside depending on your preference. If you think something like a Sundara is a little bit too bright, if you think it's a little bit too much treble, then a darker sounding headphone like this, even if it is a little bit not as good technically, is probably going to be right up your alley. Now, in some ways, I kind of like what they are doing because they are seemingly going the opposite direction of some planar headphones. For example, the Ananda Nano, very treble focused headphone. This is a lot less treble focused. This is very much for bass heads and people who like kind of that quick planar bass but don't want to deal with a brighter sounding headphone. That's kind of what you get with this headphone. And the bass response is actually really good. It hits really, really low and pretty hard and with a decent amount of impact to it. In a lot of ways, this seems like the antithesis of the Moondrop Para that we just did a first impressions of yesterday. The Para was less focused on bass and lower mids and more focused on upper mid-range and treble response. And this is sort of the opposite. It's more focused on being a little bit darker than it is a brighter headphone. Now, one area that is a little bit different here and an area that I'm not a huge fan of is there's a little bit of a push in the 1 to 3K area. There's a little bit of a shoutiness to that region where it does come across quite forward in a way that I don't personally like very much. Some people seem to be really affected by this. Others seem to be a lot less affected by this. It seemingly depends user to user, but I'm really not a fan of how much this is pushing this forward. I am hoping that this is a result of these specific pads. The other parts of the mid-range, though, are really good. The veil that I spoke of earlier doesn't seem to be dipping down low enough into the mid-range to affect the vocalists. So a lot of vocalists are really clear. They have a surprisingly good and natural tonality. I would say it's not quite up to the tonal standard of something like an HD 660S2, but it's getting pretty close. And I think it's a little bit closer to what I would consider a natural tone than something like a Sundara. So if you've heard the Sundara and think that's a little artificial sounding, this is a little bit more on the natural side of things. The sound staging, like I discussed, because of the treble response, is not the widest, though it is fairly wide. I just think that other headphones like the Sundara do beat it a little bit for sound staging and scale because of the openness sound. This in some ways sounds like it actually caps the outer edge, like there's a limit to how far out it can sound, whereas the Sundara, even though sounds don't seem like they're coming infinitely far away, you do get the sense that the space and the environment is infinite, even if the sounds can't quite travel that far. This has a more closed-in feel to some of the sound, and I think that has to do a lot with the dampening characteristics that they're using in here, whereas the Sundara is very open. As far as first impressions go, I would say that the sound quality right now is about a 6 out of 10 for the money. There's a couple areas that I'm hoping the pads will improve, but as of right now, it's kind of just okay. It's a medium performer that I could see recommending to certain people, but not everyone. It may not be a world beater yet, but maybe pads will change that. Might get a lot better with the second pair of pads. The build quality, though, is something that I think is a 10 out of 10 and is what I would sort of imagine a $500-ish headphone to be like, and I think is a step ahead of brands like Hyphen and maybe even Odyssey. It really does actually scream high quality, and it looks a lot better in person than I think it will on camera. Okay, that's going to wrap up the first impressions of the Fiio FT5. Definitely a good first start to a first planar headphone ever. All right, guys, if you missed the part of first impressions, check that out down below. If not, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.